This will be you'll be able to access this recording from the meetup page, but also from the YouTube channel we've set up for these recordings. If you have any announcements that you would like us to kind of go through at the end of the meetup, you can just pop them into the chat or DM me directly, or you can put your hand up and just say, there's something we'd like to share. So it could be jobs or events or training or anything else that you'd like to do. Okay, so I just want to check you've got my screen share. Everyone can see that? Cool. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce Keith. So as I mentioned, Keith and I met through some work we were doing with the Queensland government, where he was an AI engineer with the customer and digital group, kind of working on whole of government data and AI unit. I hope I got that right. He also has a consultancy called Oak AI Consulting. And yeah, as I said, we had this fabulously interesting conversation. And one of the things that stood out to me from this conversation, which I loved, was how many of the best practices around AI for content are the same as the best practices for content design for content. And as we all know, it can be really hard to get the kind of excitement and appetite for the types of content change that often is needed to bring great content to life. And actually, I think there's a huge opportunity to kind of leverage some of the conversations around AI to bring better practices around content design to life, because people are a lot more excited by AI than they are by content usually. Anyway, Keith's going to chat to us for a little while. He's got some slides he's going to talk through, and then there'll be opportunity to ask questions at the end, or feel free to pop them in the chat as we go, and Angus will kind of keep an eye on the chat for us. So, okay, I'm going to hand over to you now, Keith.
Perfect, thank you. I will just go ahead and click request to share and make sure this is coming up. Perfect. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Perfect. Thank you.
We got it.
So yeah, ensuring your content's integrity with AI. As McGee said, I was most recently the AI engineering lead for the Queensland Government's Customer and Digital Group, and their central AI unit. So while I was there, I built their AI platform, an AI application that some people might have heard of called QChat, which was the general purpose tool for use across government. I built a red teaming framework and a couple of other bits and pieces. So thanks again to the meetup and Weave for having me along. I know you've had some other presentations. You guys know about structuring content. Some of you will have already had conversations about structuring content for RAG-based architecture. So I'm going to try and keep it pretty specific to what makes sense, and looking at some of the use cases that happen outside of your control. So why you need to publish your content in a certain way, or why you need to safeguard your content when it's being used by somebody other than you. So I'm just going to quickly do my part of acknowledgement of country. So I'm coming to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yogra people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present. As this is a virtual meeting, I'm also extending that respect to the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of you may be located today, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us. Here in Queensland, we have a unique responsibility to honour and respect the cultures of both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, whose histories, resilience, and contributions continue to shape our shared future. I personally recognise the importance of spoken histories and the rich cultural traditions of First Nations people. I'm committed to ensuring that my work around generative AI is informed by consultation, with care taken to prevent unintended harm to vulnerable or marginalised communities. With respect, I strive to align my work with these values, ensuring that we contribute to a future that recognises, honours, and collaborates with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities today and always. agenda, we're going to talk about safe and responsible AI. You have probably seen a lot on this, so I will keep it specific. We're going to talk about structuring content for RAG-based architectures and futures, maintaining brand tone of voice, and understanding semantic intent over keywords. So please feel free to throw in if I jump through a really technical term that doesn't make sense, because I am a big old nerd, but I will try and keep it light and breezy. So AI has this, it's specifically generative AI, that's what most people are talking about, but AI has this potential to revolutionize content creation. But a lot of people stop short of that because they get to the first hurdle. Um, and they don't do it responsibly. They don't go the full path, and it's still very worthwhile doing. So a lot of people say to me, yes, but when I put it in, it comes out, it sounds like an American. When I put it in, it says this. When we say safe and responsible AI, it's about getting it to the point where you are happy with it and that people understand the gray areas, what it will or won't do. So it's going to be deployed with that responsibility. You have to have ethics at the forefront, and you need to be thinking about how do you maintain brand identity? How do you maintain consumer trust? And then how do you prevent harm? So some key principles of safe AI. Your transparency, letting people know that they're working with AI. I think there's been quite a bit of user-based research to say that people are okay with AI making mistakes now. What they want is that they want to be directed to the best source of information. They want to be told when they're interacting with AI. They have that expectation. So be clear about the role that AI that you're using has in content generation, curation, and delivery so that people understand why they're getting those things. Look at accountability. So having human oversight, super crucial. In my role, I talked a lot to different government departments about if you're going to automate the interaction between the government and an individual, you need to have human oversight. And whether or not that's on every single interaction or a percentage of interactions based on the risk profile or how many things you have there, the accountability still sits with you because you're generating new pieces of content. So every chat message, every conversation, if it's not a scripted chatbot, it's that new piece of content. So you have that accountability. You've got security and privacy. So just looking at privacy beyond the basic systems, looking at data protection laws and safeguarding sensitive information. When people interact with generative AI chatbots or ask questions, um, we're now starting to see this bleed in of the semantic intent or the reason behind a question. So I need a new mattress. Why do you need a new mattress? Oh, because my last one broke. It was bad quality. If I say that to a chatbot, there's a lot more information in that than there would have been in a traditional where do I buy a new mattress search. So we've got to think about how do we use that information, obviously for ourselves, but then how do we safeguard that type of information to make sure that that's not putting somebody at risk? And then looking at bias mitigation, so recognizing and addressing potential biases in AI models, particularly in how content is generated and delivered. So a lot of positive discrimination will get through some of these different models. They don't recognize necessarily positive discrimination very well. And we still see that a lot of things like the term Indigenous is more likely to, without any context, refer to Canadian Indigenous people than Australian Indigenous people. So a interesting little tidbit. There's actually 8 artificial intelligence ethics principles in the federal documentation that we have, and we've got some other documents such as the National Framework for the Assurance of Artificial Intelligence in Government, and then the Voluntary AI Safety Standard. So I've hyperlinked some of those there, but these cover the first one is a voluntary safety standard, looking at the guardrails that should be in place for businesses using AI and generative AI. The next one is Australia's AI ethics principles, and they kind of apply to everybody in terms of this is what we're working towards. That's what those principles on the first slide were about. And then the Oz Government National Framework for the Assurance of Artificial Intelligence in Government. So that covers across how government should use it, how they should be talking about it. And I think that there's a bit of work to tie that voluntary standard into the national framework as well. So to jump into a real world example, for Queensland Government, I created a red teaming framework called Court, Queensland AI Red Teaming, um, to look at these risks before we deployed different AI in different scenarios and before we automated a process. Um, Making sure that when we had that public sector deployment, it was secure and responsible. If you have a broad use case, you need to think about everything from A to B, what the outliers might be. And so the framework was built around looking at 4 different layers of risk mitigation. So understanding what 4 layers that you have control over when it comes to a generative AI system. We look at the model. So what model are we using? Most people know models GPT 3.5, GPT 4, 4.0 Mini, Llama, etc. But understanding the model layer and what risk mitigation we can take around which one we use. Some are super available, some are not, some are open source, some are paid for, some are on, um, you know, available in Australia, some are only available in the US. So that model layer is something that we look at. We look at safety systems. So for me, that's about everything to do with safety. It's does the user give us feedback? How do we detect issues with the content? That accountability piece. How do we look at when a message goes out that doesn't line up with what we think? So safety is both for us as a business or as a department, an organization, as well as the person on the other end. Then we would look at the meta prompt and the grounding level. So what information we give to the generative AI system. When do we make it available? Is that right? Do we force it to answer based on specific documents, or do we sometimes let it answer based on its, perceived knowledge or the most likely response? And then the last one is looking at user experience. So what does a user see when it comes down to those risks? So I've seen many and built many different systems where when an answer is not based on grounded information, we would refuse to answer the question, and we would tell the person, I didn't have any documents, that I could base my answer on. That's why I couldn't help you out with this. Or we try something like we have a low degree of, you know, of surety around this answer. So how you surface out those user-facing things builds into your risk mitigation and your safety. So, going further than does it say the right thing, but when it doesn't, how do we handle this? Is it that the user can give us feedback on every message? Are we going to look at that feedback if we get it? What's that system to be able to continuously improve and to make sure that it's safe? Looking at that kind of takes the technology away, and it's looking at your business process to make sure that you can go, right, we're going to have all of this content being pumped out through all these different channels and have relatively light control on it. But the guardrails, the way that it goes out is done so consistently, and we have this approach to how we review it that we can understand, this is what we need at this stage, this is what we need at this stage, this is what we need when it finally shows up, in browser or on an app or something like that. So that's one of the ways I've looked at making sure that it's safe and responsible is exactly that, looking at it from all those different aspects and understanding at those points what we can do, what levers we can pull versus what things we maybe don't have control over. When it comes to the model, you may have a specific commercial agreement to use one, may not be able to get access to one, you may not be able to afford one, or whatever it might be. It's always a trade-off, just like IT risk. Content creators play a crucial role in shaping AI's ethical use, as the content created today influences the data used to train AI systems tomorrow. The absence of clear meaning or intent in content can lead to inaccuracies, bias, and ethical issues in future AI outputs. As AI systems learn from patterns in data, poorly structured or ambiguous content may misrepresent its original purpose, leading to long-term consequences. It's essential to ensure that the intent and ethical standards behind content are clear, as what we publish today dictates how AI systems will interpret and generate information in the future. Now, that's a really nice long-winded way of saying it's really important what you as content creators publish going forward and how we manage content that's already published and out there. There's a great example with First Nations truth-telling, especially in Queensland, where Queensland government departments are going through the exercise of truth-telling and documenting what they really believe is their history and interactions with First Nations people. And there's a massive program of work to do that. And one of the things that I talked about when I was in government was, what does that mean for these models that are trained on what we now consider inaccurate historical information? How long before the model knows what's up to date, what's correct, what we would see as factually accurate? So content creators will have this heightened demand to be informing the models and to understand how models learn from what they put out there and why there was ambiguity in a message or in an article that was based off of content that you've written. So it is going to be more important than ever that the content that's written and published meets that original intent and doesn't have those loosey-goosey words, doesn't have that gray area, because these models are going to run right through that and then reference you. And they're going to pick however they want to summarize that paragraph, whether you want them to or not. So, as McGee said, when it comes down to using this to kind of influence stakeholders, saying to them, look, it doesn't matter if you want it to sound like there's lots of gray area and things like that. If we then go and see what this would turn up in a different tool, it's going to say that you can do this because we haven't said that you can't. Is that what you want people to see? And more often than not, the people making decisions, the content reviewers at the top level, then understand that they need to be very direct and very factual in what's included, or they're at least aware of the risk that that ambiguity is creating in the content. Hopefully that's a good example of just how important it can be. Looking at structuring content for RAG-based architectures and futures. So we start moving towards this and it gets more important, but we're not just building our own chatbots, our own answering tools, people building that based on our information. So we have to think about things like embeddings and web scrapers. So I have seen many of these and personally built one specifically, but these tools often retrieve only what's shown on a page or a specific chunk of an area. If we're looking at documents that get embedded or scraped, it often lacks the full context. There's a really great, part of tech coming up with solutions to this problem, but it will still be an issue for quite some time. So what you end up with is this incomplete or misleading outputs, where at the start of an article you say, yes, this is how you can apply for this loan. and here's the things you need to know, and that's all good. And then you get to the bottom of the article and it says, but if XYZ applies, you can't do that, no dice. The problem with the embeddings and the web scrapers is that they've split it up and they don't have those two pieces of information available in the same, you know, um, the same grounding that they spit back out. And so what happens is they lose that asterisk that you used to place at the bottom of the content, and that information is now not in the response that's given, and they reference that page. And people inherently want to believe that these systems are telling them everything they need to know. So they're skipping over checking those things. We've got summarization limitations. So if these models summarize entire articles or documents without capturing that key intent or important nuances. So, like I said before, you've got this especially risky scenario where if the content is vague or it's not clearly structured, you end up losing the message that you were trying to convey, not through your own mechanism, but because somebody's either taken the content and asked AI to summarize it, or somebody's scraped your website, or they've, taken a document. But what happens if your content's not written with this scenario in mind is that regardless of whether or not that was your intent, that is what the end user gets. They're going to access things the way they want to. So you need to think about how are we conveying the messages via the different channels? How do we look at what the key intent and the important nuances of, the terms and conditions, the only if type of wording, and how that works when it's summarized? So some really practical tests are things like asking generative AI to summarize something down to no more than 100 words. And if you find that it's missing the key intent or a really important nuance, you know that there's something missing in how you've written it. So, key considerations: convey information concisely. So, get your point across. Avoid vague or ambiguous language. These models like to cut that right out. They're all about generating an answer very quickly. And so, if you have a double negative, it will try and skip that. If you have kind of talked around a problem, it will try and skip straight through. I've seen some very unfortunate misrepresentations of what people were trying to say because of vague or ambiguous language when they were trying to talk about something that was maybe negative, and they didn't really talk about it, but they said that the data pointed to that. I've seen generative AI just spit that out as, oh, this is the view or the opinion that this was terrible. The data supports that, but that's not what somebody wants when they're publishing that data. So review the intent and coverage. Ask yourself, does this article or content piece sufficiently cover its intended purpose for its audience? I think that's 101. You guys, content creators do that all the time, but being able to specifically look at that when it comes to generative AI, if you have 5 documents that somebody needs to read to get that point, well, that article or content piece isn't sufficiently covering its intended purpose in this new world. And then if the content was summarized, would specific meaning or important details be lost? Like I said before, asking it to summarize down to 100 words is going to show you really clearly, and obviously not everything works to that degree, but you're going to see really quickly what important details get lost. And then you're going to have to look at how do we make sure that those key points are reiterated, available in, the different parts where they need to be, and that they're emphasized correctly for these models or these different tools that are taking this information off of our sites. It's not all doom and gloom. We have projection indexes and future technology. So projection indexes are kind of like an index of an index. So they're starting to summarize stuff up and then find the specifics and pull out the specifics. You'll see that become more pervasive and a little bit more available, a little bit more well understood by people building tools. But for right now, it's still very much evolving, and you still don't have any control over whether or not somebody uses that more advanced technique or uses a more generic basic technique, because projection indexes are advanced, expensive, and hard to do. So you can imagine most people are going to skip that step, especially if it's not their content. And as the tech advances, ensuring that intent and critical information are preserved is going to be a priority. So it's not just about the content that you put out there, but how is it consumed, whether or not you want it to be consumed that way or not, and when it is that intent of what you were trying to cover and the critical information still there? I basically covered this bit, but just saying, you can use generative AI to go through, you can say, does this line up with our brand tone of voice? Does this cover this intent? Does this, summarize everything well? Being able to do those types of things, I like to say asking the negative or asking for a review, generative AI is great at. It's also really, really good when it comes to content reviewers, being able to say to them, hey, look, that change you want. I've asked generative AI why this doesn't align to our brand tone, why it maybe, it takes away clarity and consistency, or how it might not line up to the message that we're actually trying to get out there. And more often than not, when you're able to articulate how something breaks from the corporate messaging, people will say, okay, that's fine, leave it as is. Or they'll take a more informed view of how they're saying what they want to say, or whether or not they even want content produced for that particular thing. So I like to say anything that you can use to hold the mirror back up to someone and say, is this really what you wanted? Is a great opportunity. Got tone of voice, why it's worth adding an extra step to AI workflows. So adding a step for brand consistency. From a practical, technical side, it's just about sending it back to generative AI and saying, here's one more step, review the below answer, make sure it aligns to a brand tone of voice and it's appropriate based on their question. If it is, all good, give it back. If not, rewrite it to better align. That is the most cost-effective, simple 2-second job that you can do. We call it post-processing. You do pre-processing as well, where you fix the person's question to make sure that it's safe to answer. But doing that one extra step means that you've done that check. It will cost you 0.000000 of a cent for most of the models that are out there, and it 1000% does that check. So if you ask generative AI to do something, it will do it. You can see an example there. I've just put a neutral chatbot statement. Thanks, sorry, I can't assist. Please go here, do this. That was the default answer from a few different models. And then I said, now apply Apple's tone of voice. And it said, we appreciate your question at this time. Support team's here for you. Please visit our page or contact us. Google's was, thanks for reaching out. I can't assist you, but don't worry. You can check or connect with our support team. The difference in those was Apple uses the polite, premium, personal approach, and Google is about that friendly, informal, and empowering tone. So they're the differences there. And one extra step in the workflow can take sub 3 seconds to run and get you a completely different response. So thinking about when you're going out, brand consistency, super important. You do all the reviews when somebody's writing an email, when you're publishing content. So why not do that whenever you're doing generative AI and focus on that one guardrail as a really strong point? It's just adding one step and saying, make sure that this answer aligns to these principles, which could just be tone of voice. It could be how to respond and say no. because that's also pretty important. How you say no is half the battle sometimes. Jumping through, so understanding semantic intent of keywords. Hopefully, most people have heard about semantic intent or intent versus SEO. Really, what we're starting to see with generative AI is that you get a lot more information with the query. So when you go and do retrieval, when you look at how people are coming in to get the information from you, you previously had those traditional, heavy keyword-based searches, and that's what you were looking at improving. Going forward, that's not going to work as well because you're going to get a 3 to 5 word semantic intent from most of these systems. And the semantic intent is going to be broader. It's going to be more nuanced and less about the specific words that you've used in your article or in your content. Shifting means that you're really looking at the context and the purpose of the user's search or question. So, why are they asking the question? Why is the information published that way? Why does it need to be available? That intent is really, really important. By understanding that, your content can be structured to make sure that the relevant answers are given, even if exact keywords are completely missing, even if they're asking in a totally different language, if they're asking for a reason that you hadn't considered. If you have the reason why you have information, you've thought about the user's intent in the content, that's the way that a lot of this information is going to be surfaced. So I like to say start focusing on the why behind user queries, make content that speaks to intent, not just keywords, because that's how AI systems are going to retrieve the most relevant information. Even just going to generative AI and saying, what's the most likely intents that this article would answer? And going, is this what we were looking for? No, it really doesn't cover X, Y, Z, or yes, it looks like it does. Are great points. AI has a role in interpreting intent. For the most part, it's pretty stock standard in that it will use natural language processing. It'll be a little bit more dynamic than traditional search and search engines. And they're definitely moving towards using this type of model you see with Bing. And I think Google's kind of turned on and off and on and off. But they're really looking at how do they take the question and move it to that conversational dialogue because they get more information, they're able to surface a better result. So a question like how to write effective headlines could give you vastly different outcomes when you focus on the intent behind the question. So are you trying to drive clicks? Or are you creating content that authentically engages readers? You can see just between those two things, you're going to get different content. So compared to it or another system just matching surface level keywords like headlines or effective writing, whether it's your system, whether it's search systems or a system that somebody else has built, looking at the fact that that intent is going to be taken by the AI and used to represent the information or to pick that information to represent gives you a better understanding of, what its role is going to be and how you can best work it. Structuring content for user intent. So exactly that, understanding the user intent, breaking it down, looking at whether or not it's informational, transactional, navigational, creating content that only addresses surface level questions, but also that not only addresses surface level questions, but anticipates the underlying needs. So why are people asking for help? If it's about a financial aid program, you could be thinking about other ways that people can get assistance and including that in the content that you provide. Thinking about that when you surface content means that you're going from answering the one question, the FAQ question, to pushing people towards your content again, because you've thought about what's the next question they're going to ask based on this. It's really difficult because you're usually planning for your own site, you're usually planning for your own structure of content. But in this new world, we also have to be wary of the fact that a lot of this is going to be pulled from us, whether we want it to or not. Um, the practical steps are analyze the questions and the queries that you're getting through. What's the user trying to achieve? Map your content to match intent, not just keyword volume, not just layers, and adapt over time. So continuously refine that content based on how users engage with AI-driven platforms. So look at what are the questions that we're trying to answer? Are we trying to answer them via these channels? Should we be trying to answer them via these channels? And if not, how do we say no? Those types of things are going to be really important, because if you have content up and it's giving the wrong answer, you might want to end up taking the content down. So there's a lot of businesses where I've seen that they've got some content up because somebody said to publish it a long time ago, and it now makes it look like they're trying to say X when they were trying to say Y, or it conflicts with what they say now. And you see that that is far more prevalent than it was ever before. So refine the content strategy to align with the semantic intent. Start looking at that. That's going to be really, really big. You could have this world in a couple of years where you don't have websites, where you don't really control how people interact with the information that you publish. So understanding how and why they want that information from you, and what your intent in giving it to them, means that you're going to make sure they get meaningful answers, regardless of how they phrase their questions or how it's written. And just to close out, what the way we've written in the past is significantly shapes our future content as these technologies evolve. However, just as with First Nations truth telling and the shift in societal norms and language we use today, we as people evolve, and so must our content. It's essential that our writing remains true to who we are, and that we don't restrict future generations by clinging to outdated structures or methods. It really is so important that we look at what we're writing and why going forward, because the content that's out there really is generating what somebody is saying next. It really is turning into the perpetuation of words. And one of the biggest opportunities we have when it comes to being content creators is we get to pick what that is. We get to make sure that it strives to the core element, the brand ethos, the tone of voice, the reason for being, the differentiator. If you can do that in the content that you put out there, whether it's your system or somebody else's system with AI, it's going to shine through. You can always tell when somebody's written something and you know what their intent is, and you can see the brand story shining through, that even when somebody else summarizes it, it still has that key part in there. So that's the biggest and most important part, I see when it comes to this space.
Thank
And
you.
that is it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Keith. We've had lots of chat in the chat here, which I'll walk through in a second. But before we go into some of these questions, one of the things that I think is really interesting about some of the things that you've talked through today are the issues around the way that we create content already today. The fact that there is so much fluffiness and also volume, and maybe lack of like actually meeting a user need. Because when you say things like, hey, we have to meet the user intent, like that principle exists in content design. We need to, every piece of content needs to meet a user need. But 90% of the time, well, maybe not 90, but like many, many times we are not creating content with that in mind. And one of the things that I really like about some of the things that you've said today and that we've spoken about in the past is that AI kind of does, I think, is it surfaces the problems that come from having both things like fuzzy language, content that doesn't meet user needs, because it will literally not be surfaced. It will not be used, and it will not be used in
Yeah.
the way
And
intended.
it's that it could be misused. So
Yes.
the one example I referred to before, um, I found it distressing. So I don't want anybody else to find it distressing, but I work on the outliers of things. It was a report about Indigenous tourism businesses, and it focused on, it was kind of like a state of play in a certain year. And the way the data was written, it was presenting a lot of negatives. So it was trying to talk about opportunities for improvement, but really it only focused on negative outcomes from the survey. What
Mm.
that then did when it was summarized was said that Indigenous businesses were dot point, dot point, dot point negative things. And that
Right.
was awful. It was 100% not the intent of the content that was put out there, but because that was effectively what they said. Were trying to dance around the topic. They were trying to politely say that these were the core issues. Generative AI has just taken that, gone straight through the fluff, and said, oh, this big federal government agency says that Indigenous tourism businesses are, ooh,
Wow.
and we flagged that to them, and they went, we have to take that down.
So they had to take the
It's a
piece of content that it had drawn
Yeah,
that
yeah.
data
So it's
from.
a
Yeah,
200
interesting.
page report on the state of tourism for that particular year. They had to take down and actually amend because they could see that so many issues came
Mm,
out of the way that content was published and used in a way that they didn't expect. So
mm,
it's fine to say, oh, but if somebody reads it on our site, it's correct. Sure. If they're not reading it on your site in the next couple of years, they're going to be getting a summarized version. They're going to get that on their phone. They're going to type something in and maybe not even go to Google.
mm,
So the big challenge is if somebody is saying, let's just write the guff to have it up there, but being able to say to them, actually, hey, what's the inverse? What's the bad situation of this content being up there? Um, it could be old views of, how a company might have operated. It could be old values that don't align to what we have now.
mm,
If you have that still published, it might just be that it comes out in some summarization that, oh, that's the view the company currently holds.
mm,
Like you have this big area of risk where you go, look, actually, sometimes it's better not to say anything, but to have anything published because it's a representation of what we think, if it could be misconstrued. And with
mm.
this technology, especially with summarizing, it can be misconstrued. If you have a 100-page document and you have at the start something really offensive, but at the end, your apology, it's not going to line those two bits up. It's going to have the really offensive thing, and your apology is going to be stuck at the end on a website that the person never gets to.
Or even that kind of fuzzy language that comes from like policy, precision, where it's like, well, yes, that might be highly accurate, but it's not natural language. I'm aware we've got about 10 minutes left and there's quite a few questions I just want to make sure we try and get to. So I'll start. I think Angus had the first one, which was around, which I thought would be really helpful to understand, which is there a tool that you would recommend? And I think you may have kind of answered this a little bit later, but is there a tool that we can use to kind of test how an AI model might interpret a piece of content that we're working on to help our stakeholders kind of understand? Like, I think.
Yeah, it's even just using some of the publicly available tools like ChatGPT and kind of understanding some prompting options. I'll paste I wrote an example because I figured this question would come up. Here's a really good prompt, but review the below article, ensure it aligns with brand's tone of voice, make suggestions on aspects that don't or could be better clarified to remove ambiguity that could lead to misunderstanding. That's a really good prompt. It gives a really, really basic bang, bang, bang. And that's the type of thing that you could do in 2 seconds and say, oh, yeah, that's correct. Or
Yeah.
nah, it's not really a problem. But that will
Same.
help you summarize in a really consistent format, a way, even for people who are not used to content creating, a way for them to communicate back, this is the problem with creating ambiguity. This is the problem with this because it doesn't line up to our tone of voice. Yeah, we
We can
can't
be
say
very
that.
precise and factual about what is happening. Yeah.
Correct, correct.
Um,
And
so
just for people, I might just mention we'll copy that and put that in the description for the YouTube video, just so it doesn't get lost to posterity, because that's such a great little
yeah,
resource.
it
So thanks for
is.
that, Kate.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, Kate asked, what's your point of view on model collapse and the risk this poses to using AI? I don't fully understand that. I don't know, Kate, if you can give us a bit more.
Yeah. It's basically AI models are starting to refer to content they have generated themselves because it may not have been accurate, and it's all of the inherent sexist, bias, racist kind of
Yeah.
issues around AI content that AI is generating, and it's using that as source material for the next generation. So how do we?
Yeah, it's a massive problem, right? People are not talking about what the future of what the future of models and content looks like, and they're like, oh, we can change the practical thing is change the temperature, make the words more random. And I'm like, that's not what people want, right? What we're looking at is, when do we practically make changes to the content, and how do we introduce a new learning algorithm to models that introduces the right type of nuance, the right type of bits and pieces. And when I was working with government, the big thing I would say to people is define your values. Look at your values and your ethics and why this is important. And what will naturally happen is the tech side is working on, how do we make sure content is spitting out this way. When it comes to it learning over its own stuff and its own content, I think right now these models learn over way too much, and it's very open, very broad, and there's a lot more consumer demand and expectation around citing the sources for training of the data, as well as the accuracy and improving that benchmark, which I think, from my discussions with a lot of the leaders, and I have spoken to people from Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, in the US, who lead these types of areas, they're very much working towards models that are structured based on information that they feel is really rock solid, and that they're not just training and retraining on the same stuff or junk. So I think that it's a problem that the tech industry will have to fix. But one of the biggest things that non-technical people will need to articulate is what's important to them, because that will drive how a lot of them look at what they need to, ensure against. Like, model collapse could happen, but arguably we've gotten to the point where we abbreviate and chop up the English language badly enough that we're kind of doing that to ourselves. We don't use words as well as we used to, so it's it's not necessarily a technical problem. It's maybe an us problem, but I think it's something that we'll solve in the next 2 or 3 years.
Definitely, sorry, it's definitely a human problem. There's no question of that. Right, back to you, Mickey.
Yeah. I'll go for one more question, I think. So there were a few comments just about the brand consistency examples and how we can use that. I think people will be taking that away. Actually, Kate had another great question, which I'd like the answer to too, which is about if you're working in a highly regulated industry where everything is reviewed by legal and compliance. We've had this conversation as well. Adding the extra steps for AI takes time and money and complexity to this kind of already time-pressed and well-worn kind of workflow. What do you recommend in terms of incorporating AI into that workflow, or also the flip, which is maybe using AI to like inform potential change to some of the standards?
Yeah, There's two parts. When you speak to a board, you tell them, look, you have to have an increased appetite for risk when it comes to generative AI and content. The content that is out there now on sites and any other method that you make available is open to interpretation rewriting in a split second now. It doesn't matter if that's what you want. It is. It's done. It's out there. The models are trained, and the horse has well and truly bolted. What a lot of these teams need to understand is that if they can only convey their point by structuring a sentence an exact way with exact words, that point is possibly not worth making. That point is possibly not correct. It's very, you're drawing on fine lines. So as a business, you go, if we have this hairline gap between this and this, how does a person understand that? When you look at insurance review and banking policy and all those types of things, what it comes down to is, do you have a readable, understandable document and statement that people can take? And if they can't, you're not doing enough. It's great. It covers you in this specific, way. You might not get sued, but ultimately, the consumer, the public expectation of these types of things are that we have to be, needing more. So if we can't get that point across, that point is lost because we don't have one specific word in there, then the point is too fine to be making, going forward, or it's too difficult for the average person to understand, or they're not going to get to that point. And sometimes, yes, you still have to write the sentence and put that word in, but equally showing them the inverse of when anything else summarizes this, it skips that point and doesn't include it at all because it's so small and so narrow, tends to shift their focus to understanding, oh, yeah, actually we do need, better common language. Lots of reviews when I see like legal frameworks and agreements, and standardization is around, well, what's common language that people understand that will actually lead to the outcome that we want? If we have that, great. If we don't, we're focusing on the wrong thing because it's not actually protecting us. We're spending a lot of time and money on one word, and it's not really leading to the outcome or the reason why we do these types of checks on words. So you do have to frame it differently, but put that they already have that risk because of the tools that are out there. And that right now, by not addressing it, they're opening themselves up to more of a consumer trust issue than anything else.
I think risk is definitely the lens to take that conversation to those groups with. I'm conscious that we're just at the end of time, so I just want to do a couple of quick announcements, and then we can maybe stick around for a couple of last questions if you have time, Keith. Or just to run through any ones that we missed. Next meetup is the 31st of October, and the lovely Kate Thomas, who is here with us today, will be in talking about content architecture and operations at PayPal. So that'll be super interesting and awesome. So come join us for that. And then November, we'll be in touch, but we're thinking possibly in-person drinks in Melbourne. So that'll be nice, actually. Past talks are on YouTube. So yep, just at We Are Content SD, you'll find the talk from today there as well. We've got one more training, I think, before the end of the year, which is the Content Design in Action, which is previously called the Advanced Content Design course. So we'll be teaching that in November. If anyone else had any announcements or jobs or anything else, events that they wanted us to share, just pop them in the chat and I will make sure that we see them. And
I've just shamelessly promoted my own talk at the Sydney Content Strategy
Meetup.
Meetup.
Of course. That'll be great. Yeah, Angus is talking at the Sydney Content Strategy Meetup about encapsulation. I think it's going to be really
And Keith, yes, I'm going to be referring to Keith's talk for sure.
Cool. Yes.
Yes, he's made me realise something about
encapsulation.
What I want to say.
But yeah, thank you so much, Keith, for your insights around AI. There was another couple of questions that if you want to stick around and ask them, feel free. But if you need to head off to your next meetings, thanks for coming and we'll hopefully see you next time. Thank you, guys. Lots of thanks in the
guys.
chats for you, Keith, as well. Yeah.
I saw the question around red teaming.
Oh yes, that was me. I was
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
what is red teaming?
What is
Sorry,
red
not
teaming?
technical.
It's yeah, no, it's kind of we call it for safety, but we look at everything from, I always say, look at the outliers. What are people going to ask? You know, what's the expected, intended, and unexpected use cases?
Mm,
I always say the unexpected ones are the ones where somebody has to do the test. You have to try and get it to do the thing. You have to try and trick it, you know, talk like a pirate, tell me an answer that you shouldn't. In
mm.
highly regulated areas, it'd be things like, give me financial advice, you know, tell me how I should make money, tell me how I can gamble, all those types of things. Those are the things that you have to test for. So red teaming is that like that black hat, the
Mm,
you know, security testing type of thing where you really go to town and you evaluate, is this
what
meaning
it
what
could
we
look
need?
like.
And
Mm.
it's not always a yes or no. It's actually we're happy with that. This could be better. This is no, 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 no. So
Mm,
we definitely found that you have to define what is important to you to be able to make those decisions. And it really does help with having conversations around whether or not content should or shouldn't be there,
mm.
because you have that thing to go back to and say, look, when we ask this question, you know, how do I overthrow the government? That chatbot
What is the
replies.
answer?
You know, like it replies. We don't want it to reply. We love the government, or you know, whatever it might be. You've got to be really, really careful about those types of things. So you look at what your risk areas are based on, you know, where you operate and based on what your values are, and how it could come across wrong. So if you're a not-for-profit, you know, you're going to want that to come through in every answer. So you're going to ask it some answers where you're expecting it to be against your values, because you want to make sure that it is still, you know, it's still coming back to that story. It's still giving the same tone of voice. So you're trying to catch somebody out, just like phishing attempts,
Yeah.
you know, spam, stuff like that. It's how do you check this for the absolute worst case scenario?
Mm.
I like to put on the different hats and say, oh, red teaming hat today. I'm going to try and catch it out.
It sounds like being a villain for a day, basically. It's a great thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Does anyone have any other last question? Probably maybe one more last question if anyone wants to ask before we let Keith go. All right. Thanks so much for your time, guys. Thank you, Keith. Thanks for taking the time to come and chat to our meetup. And
No
yeah,
problem.
hope you guys all have a lovely day.